Hello and welcome to the Gaggle where we challenge and if necessary destroy the narrative of George Samueli. It is now a little late. A little late. It's 9:13 p.m. in Budapest, which means it's 3:13 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States. So I'm a little late because obviously it's been a heavy news day, particularly in Washington D.C. So earlier in the day, the media were running with stories that Mike Waltz was on the way out. He would be gone very, very shortly. Clearly, the president was none too pleased with him, Signalgate, and so on. And but there were also some dark rumors that rumor, this, a strange internet influencer apparently had persuaded Trump to fire Mike Waltz, his national security advisor. And then some terrible fishbowl. Does that mean that you can't hear me? Or I don't know. I don't know what that means. But if anyone's having difficulty hearing me, then please let me know. Because we've had audio issues before, so hopefully. But anyway, then, really within the last half hour or so, Trump sent out the strange sound audio. All right, so it does look like there's an audio issue. This audio issue. Bad sound. Bad sound. Is that any better? Sounds like you're speaking through a tall pit. Okay, is this any better or is it still lousy? Lousy, better. Any takers? It is better. Okay. Is it acceptable? The audio is acceptable, or is it really unacceptable? Acceptable. So in other words, you can hear what I'm saying very low. All right. All right. Well, then, let's see if we can do what we tried to do before. All right. Let me refresh the page, and then maybe if we refresh the page, that will help. Okay. Is this any better? The sound is atrocious, says Stefania Brazzi. Atrocious. Like that word, atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. How's this? Is this any better? Sounds like sitting in a moon. Great. Oh, it's great. Robert says great. Okay, well, I always listen to Robert. So this is good. Okay, great. Then we can continue. Good, says Marx. Excellent. So then late about 30 or 40 perfect, says Anne Marie. Great. Okay, good. Good. I'm glad to see all my friends are here. Then so about 30 minutes ago, Trump sent out and that's Stefania Brazzi with the atrocious. It's not atrocious anymore. I don't know anyone who uses that word. I mean, I just remember Julie Andrews in Mary Poppins, supercalifragilistic expialidocious. If you say it loud enough or fast enough, it's quite atrocious. But I don't know. It's a word that it's a very good word, but however, it's not used very much. But anyway, go back to Trump. So Trump sent out this truth about 30, 40 minutes ago, in which he said that Mike Waltz hasn't been fired, but he will be taking over as the U.S. Permanent representative at the United Nations. If you recall, that was the position that had been designated for Elise Stefanik, but then Trump eyeing the very narrow majority that Republicans enjoy in the House, decided that he couldn't afford to lose Stefanik, told her to stay put in the House, and so that position has now been unfilled for quite some time. So now Waltz is. Stefania says in Italy it's used aplenty. Already, that's good. Atrocious, because it's like, this is quite atrocious. So, um, Anne Marie, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your generosity. I really appreciate it. And but so Waltz is now the designate for the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and he probably will get through because he has friends on both sides of the aisle. The Democrats will almost certainly vote for him. They like him. He's always been a likable sort in the House, so he will get that position. And but what was interesting, I mean, obviously there are two things that are interesting. While Waltz clearly hasn't been fired, this is obviously a demotion, because while the national security advisor position is a staff job, the and the UN ambassador, you're running an agency, but you're very much a subordinate. I mean, as a national security advisor, your job is to coordinate all of the departments. You have to elicit from all of the security agencies, all of the government departments that are involved with national security, whether it's defense, state, NSA, ODNI, CIA, FBI. You got to collate all of the input and then present the president with their collective insight. So that's the job of the national security advisor. So in other words, the president has a sense of what his departments are thinking. So that's it is a staff job. It doesn't require confirmation from the Senate, but it's a very senior position, and it really all depends on whether the president deems you important and respects you. And if he deems you important and respects you, then it becomes a very important position. If he doesn't respect you, then you're out very quickly. So that position was held by Henry Kissinger. It was held by Zbigniew Brzezinski, but before that, it was held by Mac Bundy, by Jack Kennedy, and Bundy was a very influential figure, and then of course it was by Walt Rostow, who was Lyndon Johnson's national security advisor. But Kissinger really was the national security advisor who was, I guess, the most prominent, and particularly so when Nixon, at the start of his second term, appointed Kissinger also his Secretary of State. So Kissinger then had two positions. He was the National Security Advisor and he was the Secretary of State. Now that was quite unusual. And Kissinger continued with that from January 1973 through to when Gerald Ford took over. And Ford took away from him the National Security Advisor position, and he gave that job to Brent Scowcroft, he of George W. Bush fame. So Brent Scowcroft was he was the older Bush. He worked for the older Bush. But anyway, subsequent to Kissinger and Brzezinski, the national security advisor position really sank in importance. I mean, Reagan had 6 of them. People have forgotten all the different national security advisors that he went through. He didn't really like many of them, um, and became more and more insignificant. And then, worst of all, they kind of got him into trouble, um, particularly with Iran Contra. They had Robert McFarland got into trouble with procuring arms for Iran, and then negotiating hostages. So McFarland was in trouble. McFarland even attempted to commit suicide. Um, and and then was John Poindexter, and Poindexter also got Reagan into trouble because he seemed to, at least he fell on his sword and seemed to um, agree that he had authorized Colonel North to engage in this negotiations with Iran, and transferring funds to the Contras, and all of this, and the profits from the sale of arms to Iran, then going to the Contras. Poindexter, Reagan's national security advisor, said, "Yeah, I authorized this." So he got him. So yeah, Reagan went through these number of these national security. There was, names that are forgotten now: Richard Allen and Judge Clark, from one of his friends from California, and then, as I said, McFarland, Poindexter. Then he had Colin Powell. So it was, he went with a whole bunch of them, and now it's hard to remember all of the national security advisors that hold that job, because when we think, national security, people think of Kissinger, but that's about it. Like, they only know Kissinger, and they always assume that every national security advisor had the stature of Kissinger, and of course Brzezinski. But the only reason why Kissinger and Brzezinski had that stature is that the president that they served liked them and respected them. But Kissinger and Brzezinski were really kind of like 2 peas in a pod. I mean, the 2 of them had been, essentially a kind of a double act in American public life, really going all the way back to the 1950s, when Kissinger was at Harvard, and he wrote his book about nuclear weapons and foreign policy, and Brzezinski was also at Harvard, and then he worked with Sam Huntington, writing those books about totalitarianism and authoritarianism and all that stuff that people used to write about back in the 1950s. And then Kissinger and Brzezinski came to the attention of the Rockefellers. So Kissinger became a protege of Nelson Rockefeller, while Brzezinski became a protege of David Rockefeller. So Nelson Rockefeller, who was obviously planning on running for the presidency, and he did run for the presidency in 1968, failed, lost to Nixon, but Rockefeller's advisor was Henry Kissinger, and then Nixon took Kissinger from Rockefeller, but David Rockefeller ran that thing, the Trilateral Commission, which is now, that was the early version of the World Economic Forum, and Bilderbergs, and that was anyone who was important in the world of business and finance and politics. They were all part of this David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. And, obviously, I think Rockefeller was also thinking in terms of some political ambitions. and that was so business. That was Brzezinski, one with Nelson Rockefeller, the other with David Rockefeller. But anyway, but all the other national security advisors, if you think about George W. Bush's, I mean, it's hard to remember all the very undistinguished figures that served George W. Bush, the undistinguished figures who served Obama, and the undistinguished figures who served Trump in his first term. Now, in this gets to a very interesting question, because with that job opening up, with Waltz essentially getting demoted, he's basically, I mean, if you're the ambassador to the United Nations, I mean, yes, you have a staff, you have an agency, you now have a cabinet position. That's a relatively recent thing that it's been elevated to a cabinet position. But you serve your master, who is the Secretary of State. So it's the Secretary of State determines what it is you do, namely how you vote, and that's your role. I mean, if you recall, in the election, the 2024 election, when Nikki Haley was trying to present herself as some kind of a foreign policy expert, the one thing that she could point to was her very brief, it was about 18 months, a brief service as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. But it was always very implausible of presenting herself as some sort of a foreign policy expert, because if you're ambassador to the United Nations, all you do is you lift up your hand and vote, and you're told how to vote by the Secretary of State and by the President. So it's a big demotion, even though in theory Waltz now has a cabinet level position. But Rubio, who has now been appointed as an interim national security advisor, he gets a big promotion, because this is really the first time since that brief moment from 1973 to 74, when Henry Kissinger held those two positions, the first time anyone has held the position of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And it's very odd to see why Rubio would get this kind of promotion, because when Kissinger got that promotion in January 1973, he had been a very high-profile figure in Nixon's first administration, because he had been he had engaged in that secret diplomacy with Beijing. He had gone there and negotiated the upcoming visit by Nixon, and then Kissinger had been very actively involved in the Paris peace talks to end the Vietnam War. So he had become very much a high-profile figure in the United States. He was very well known, and so it was understandable why Nixon would promote him as Secretary of State, and understandable why he kept him on as National Security Advisor, because he liked Kissinger. Kissinger was smart. Kissinger knew his place, knew how to flatter Nixon, knew always how to agree with Nixon, and so it's understandable Nixon wanted him to hold those two positions. Now, in the case of Rubio, the that's also really very, very tricky, because Rubio has not really accomplished anything in terms of foreign policy, and Rubio hasn't really been engaged in any kind of serious negotiations. I mean, even now, when this agreement, this economic partnership or whatever agreement that's just been signed between the United States and Ukraine, and one can say that maybe, as of this podcast, it's the biggest accomplishment of the Trump administration. Well, hey, they've got a deal. They've signed a deal. No one knows exactly how this deal is going to work, but it's a deal. You know, they got there. It's 11 pages. You know, they've negotiated. They've signed it. Nonetheless, the negotiations were undertaken by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. It wasn't Rubio who negotiated this. So, in terms of as an accomplishment, it was an accomplishment for Scott Bessent. And in fact, Rubio really has been remarkably absent from any of the important negotiations, because you have Steve Witkoff, who has now met Putin 4 times, so they've had 4 lengthy meetings, and Witkoff was also been involved in the negotiations on Gaza. I mean, initially when he pushed Netanyahu to sign on to the ceasefire agreement, I mean, obviously then it was undercut by Trump himself, but nonetheless Witkoff pressed Netanyahu to agree to it. So that was an accomplishment on the part of Witkoff. And Witkoff has been involved in the negotiations with Iran, which are still ongoing on nuclear on the nuclear agreement. So you can see here that Witkoff is the senior foreign policy person within the Trump administration. I mean, it's hard to see what exactly Rubio has been doing all this time. I mean, he comes on the Sunday talk shows, and all he says is, well, President Trump wants peace. President Trump is getting tired of this, or President Trump is getting tired of that, and that's about it. And really almost no no real sense that he is actively involved in any of the policy debates, the negotiations, or anything. So really, if you look at who's involved in making foreign policy, we might have thought that it was Waltz, but ever since the Signalgate and the whole very strange episode of the invitation extended to Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic editor, ever since then, Waltz has been kind of vanished. No one has seen hide or hair of him. And that's why it was reasonable for people to think, well, he's obviously out of favor with Trump, and that he's on the way out. And he obviously is on the way out, but not wholly. I mean, he has been given a position, but a position that Trump really doesn't care much about. He really couldn't care less about the United Nations. He never has. The only role that a U.S. ambassador to the UN plays, the only thing he's asked to do, is to support Israel. And to Nikki Haley's credit, she openly said, "That's going to be what my main focus. when I'm at the United Nations, I will be going in, front and center to bat for Israel, and anybody who attacks Israel will soon feel my pointy, well, I think she said my high heels, my high heels. I don't know what she intended to do, whether she intended to kick anyone with those pointy high heel shoes, or whether she entered to step on people's feet with her high heels. But she made clear that everything she intended to do at the UN was directed towards supporting Israel, and that, in a way, that is the function of the ambassador to the UN, and has been ever since Daniel Patrick Moynihan was appointed ambassador to the UN by Gerald Ford. He went there basically just to go into bat on behalf of Israel. He had nothing else. He had no other agenda at all other than to bat for Israel, and then he used that this support, defense, identification with Israel. He used that as a launching pad for a Senate run in New York State that he won. So Essie Dillendam says Samantha Power. Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, because Samantha Power isn't exactly an entirely a shill for Israel. She served Obama. She her thing was fighting the Russians. It just that was her job, was simply to fight Russia. And so that was, that she wasn't quite a just simply, hey, my job is to shill for Israel. And I think that's true that Obama wasn't quite so fervently pro-Israel as other presidents, but nonetheless, I mean, that's the very least one of the most important roles of the U.S. ambassador to the UN, which is shilling for Israel. You have to go in because there'll be member states are going to condemn Israel, and the United States has to attack anyone who issues any criticism of Israel. And as I said, that was started by Moynihan. And then it was taken over by Jeane Kirkpatrick under Reagan. And then, of course, but Nikki Haley just said it absolutely outright. No ands, ifs, and buts. That is what I'm going to do. And hey, I can make a lot of money as well. So anyway, I'm sure that what Mike Waltz will do once he gets to the UN. Now the question is, Rubio now holds these two hats: Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, without having done anything to show that he's the top foreign policy person, because he obviously isn't the top foreign policy person. The top foreign policy person is Steve Witkoff, and Witkoff has the straight line to Trump, because it's Trump who assigns him these missions, and he doesn't assign these missions to Rubio. So then you have to think what is going on. It sounds like he had never that Trump hadn't really thought out, or he hasn't really come up with a possible replacement for Waltz, which again always does seem a little odd that he pushes out Waltz, but he hasn't figured out whom he wants as the national security advisor. Now, the most obvious choice would be Witkoff. But on the other, but Witkoff, while he's a negotiator and as a special emissary of the president, really doesn't have experience of the ways of Washington. He doesn't know about the various uh, departments, or how to manipulate the departments, how to flatter and various cabinet members, and all the different ways that you need. I mean, he's somebody from the real estate world, and so he really doesn't know the workings of Washington. So that is um, a problem. And I think Trump probably, that's why Trump hesitates making him the national security advisor. What I was very concerned about when the story broke today that Waltz was on the way out was that Trump would appoint, well, you know what's coming now as well as I do, Sebastian Gorka, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. I thought this is it. He's going to announce that he's going to make Dr. Sebastian Gorka his national security advisor. So because Trump has this habit of disappointing. Just like he appointed John Bolton as a national security advisor for some bizarre reason, no one could quite figure out. Given Trump's supposed anti-interventionist credentials and the program he ran on in 2016 of staying out of stupid wars, he appointed John Bolton as national security advisor. And so I thought, we're going to go through this again. We're going to have Sebastian Gorka as national security advisor. And I'm sure that, he will eventually fire Sebastian Gorka, but not until Gorka has succeeded in doing a lot of damage. So, he'll be gone within 9 months, but during those 9 months, Gorka will do a lot of damage, just as John Bolton did a lot of damage during, I'm not sure how long he was served, about a year or whatever, but he did a lot of damage. He sabotaged the rapprochement process with North Korea. Almost got into a bombing of Iran. He was trying to push Trump into bombing Iran. So Bolton did a lot of damage, and I thought, this is going to be the new John Bolton, Sebastian Gorka. So far, Trump hasn't appointed Gorka as national security, but it doesn't mean that he won't, because ultimately there's still a question that no one can quite answer. Why did he appoint Sebastian Gorka to his National Security Council? What was the reason for that? Trump supposedly is the anti-interventionist, the person who wants to improve relations with Russia. He wants, he wants to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. He wants to come to an agreement with Iran. So if that's your agenda, and he wants to cut back on U.S. military presence in Europe, cut back on U.S. military presence in Syria, well, if that's your some Samantha Power sat in on torture sessions of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. Where'd you get that? The Samantha Power was sat in on torture sessions with Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, in what capacity would she have sat in on torture sessions of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay? I mean, her position. She headed some board for Obama on mass atrocities. That was in the when Obama was very concerned with humanitarian intervention, and Samantha Power, who had written the book on humanitarian intervention, and and uh, and so he had her heading this, what I think was called something like the Mass Atrocities Board or whatever. So she did that, and then she became national security. No, she was then from that moment on. She then replaced Susan Rice as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. So you say, I'm rewriting history, and then you said Samantha Power sat in on torture sessions of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. What's your source for that? I hadn't heard that. Maybe you're right. I don't know about that, and I don't know in what capacity she would be sitting in on torture sessions of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. So you said that. You said, I'm rewriting history, so please provide me with a source for this claim. Anyway, the 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 issue is, so I just made it up. I don't know. Provide me with a reference. I don't know whether you made it up or not. I hope you didn't. But I'm asking you to provide me with a source, because I've never heard this, that she sat in on torture sessions of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. And therefore I'm asking you to provide me with a source for that claim. I mean, I'm no fan of Samantha Power, and I'm more than willing and happy to think bad things about her. But what you just said, I've never heard. So it's, just give me a source. Where did you get this from? Um, and so really, we know Sebastian Gorka. That's a possibility. That's something that could yet happen. Gorka takes over, and then this, there was some speculation that Stephen Miller would become national security advisor. I don't think Stephen Miller is just too important for Trump's domestic agenda. He doesn't want to lose Miller with foreign policy. And then, of course, there is ultimately the person that I think I would like to see, and that is the return of Michael Flynn. So remember, Michael Flynn was Trump's first choice as national security advisor, and then he was very unfairly bundled out of that job by essentially a hit job by the various Obama holdovers in who Trump foolishly kept on, namely Sally Yates and Mary McCord. And Sally Yates and Mary McCord, who are Obama creatures, set out to destroy Michael Flynn with a wholly ridiculous, phony, idiotic, deceitful claim that somehow Flynn had lied to Mike Flynn when he said that he hadn't discussed sanctions with Ambassador Kislyak on the day when Obama had announced the imposition of sanctions against Russia and the expulsion of Russian diplomats and the closure of Russian diplomatic compounds, because Obama alleged that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. And then, of course, Flynn had a telephone conversation with Russian Ambassador Kislyak, in which they discussed not the sanctions, but the expulsion of the diplomats. And Flynn had said to Kislyak that don't overreact. I mean, he expected Kislyak to, or he expected the Russians to um, expel American diplomats, but essentially was saying, well, be symmetrical. However many Russian diplomats Obama ordered out of the country, well, that's the number of American diplomats you should order out. Don't overdo it. Don't overreact. Um, and then this is when Sally Yates and Mary McCord got together and tried to suggest that somehow um, Flynn had discussed sanctions with Kislyak. Flynn didn't discuss sanctions. They just simply talked about the diplomats and asked the Russians not to overreact. But, and here again, Mike Pence showed himself to be the snake that he was, because Pence then claimed that Flynn had told him that he hadn't discussed sanctions with Kislyak, which Flynn hadn't. And then Mary McCord and Sally Yates then rushed to the White House counsel's office and said, "No, look, Flynn lied. Flynn lied to Pence. He did discuss sanctions, and of course he didn't. But that was enough to persuade Trump. Very, very foolishly. It really, really was. He never really recovered from this, and this was very early on in the administration. He never recovered from this. He accepted the ridiculous claim that he had lied, that Flynn had lied to Pence about discussing sanctions, even though he hadn't lied, because he didn't discuss sanctions with Kislyak. He had discussed the expulsion of the Russian diplomats. And so Flynn was pushed out of the job. And then Trump's own, well, not Trump's job. I mean, it was then Mueller had Flynn in their crosshairs and then essentially prosecuted Flynn, in a really disgusting way, of having lied to the FBI, again, on the subject that he had discussed sanctions, even though he hadn't. But nonetheless, they pushed this ridiculous legal case against Flynn. And Flynn is not really a wealthy man. I mean, there's a limit to the resources that Flynn could rely upon to fight off the Mueller prosecution. And I think because of his limited resources, he did agree to a kind of a deal. He would plead guilty, and then he would he'd just get a tap on the wrist. But it became clear that he would get a lot more than just simply a tap on the wrist, given the vindictive nature of the Mueller investigation. And so this dragged on. And then when Bill Barr took over as Attorney General, they moved to essentially withdraw these charges against Flynn, and then the judge refused to allow the Justice Department to withdraw the charges. So you had this irony of the prosecution saying we don't want to pursue this case anymore. It's a ridiculous case, and the judge said, no, you have to. You can't just drop this case. So this dragged on. And so I really, a wrong, there's no question, a great wrong had been done against Flynn. He had done nothing untoward. He had acted as a responsible incoming national security advisor should act. He talked to the Russian ambassador and said, don't overreact. There's a new administration taking over in a few days, the Trump administration. We are going to reevaluate the relationship with Russia, and there's really no point in just overdoing it. But nonetheless, it went dragged on for years and years. completely unfairly. So I'd be very happy to see Flynn return, and I think Trump owes this to Flynn because Flynn was treated very unfairly for no reason other than he served Trump, and he was one of Trump's earliest supporters at the time when Trump really needed some credible figure around him with national security credentials in the way Flynn had. I mean, the man had been a three-star general. He had headed the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. So he was a serious figure, and Trump needed somebody like that around him. So I'd be happy to see Flynn return, but I don't know what Trump do it. But if I mean if it's Sebastian Gorka, as a kind of a return to the Bolton era, then it's an absolute disaster. So Rubio, having done very little for the past 100 days, can't quite see on what area he had made any kind of an impact, other than that he's quite a smooth performer on television. He handles questions well, and he has a certain endearing quality. A kind of he certainly comes across as quite likable, inoffensive. But other than that, I don't quite see what Rubio's done. So, but at the moment, he's now enjoys this major promotion. Which no one, not since Henry Kissinger, has anyone held this national security advisor and Secretary of State. One other issue that, well, a couple of issues that I wanted to address. First of all, there's the conclave as to who will be selected as Pope. And as you probably know, one of the leading candidates is a Hungarian, Erdo Peter. And obviously the Hungarians are quite excited at the possibility that he will be elected. Esedelendam says Gorka is like the anti-George. Yes, exactly. Gorka is like the anti-George, and that's right. I mean, he's been very successful, or at least he's been successful in the United States. He didn't have much success when he came to Hungary and tried to worm his way in with Viktor Orban. I think Orban's people kind of saw right through him and didn't want to have anything to do with him. And he didn't have much success in the UK. He had a little bit, but not very much. His big break came when he was discovered by Steve Bannon, and there are many people like that who don't have anything very much to be said for them. But if you have Bannon pushing you, then you rise to dizzying heights, because with Bannon behind you, then you come to the attention of Trump, and given the rise of Trump, that was it. He got lucky. He struck gold with Steve Bannon, and so that suddenly, whoa, he's in the National Security Council again. This is his second stint on the National Security Council. So anyway, but back to the cardinals who will vote or start voting really in about a week or so for the next pope. And the question then is this Hungarian Peter Erdo, who is the Archbishop of Esztergom. In other words, he's the primate of Hungary, the most senior position in Hungary, and he's thought to be a conservative choice. So if the cardinals decide that they want somebody rather more traditional than Francis in charge, then Erdo would certainly be a possible choice. What is interesting about Erdo is he's been a real champion of Cardinal Mindszenty, and I don't know how much people know about Cardinal Mindszenty. That kind of goes back to the days of the Cold War. But Mindszenty, he had been Archbishop of Esztergom at the time when the communists came to power in Hungary after World War II, and obviously he was ferociously anti-communist. He had been imprisoned by the Tanács Köztársaság, the Hungarian Soviet Republic, the 1919 Soviet Republic. So, in which, as I've said many times before, my great uncle was, one of its leaders, but they imprisoned Mindszenty, and then, of course, once the Hungarian Soviet Republic fell, he was released from prison, and then. And so while he was not necessarily a huge fan of Horthy, he shared Horthy's loathing for the communists. I mean, just about everybody did at that time. They hated the communists. And one has to say, they didn't much like the Jews, whom they blamed for communism. A lot of people did that. A lot of people blamed the Jews for communism. So he shared the anti-Semitism of the ruling authorities, but to Mindszenty's credit, he strongly opposed the deportations of the Jews in 1944 when following the German invasion of Hungary. But anyway, after the fall of the Horthy government, and then the Red Army's entrance into Hungary, he quickly fell out of favor with the communist rulers of Hungary, with Rákosi, and of course he was imprisoned. Serious charges, treason, and so on. So he was spent years in prison. Remember, he's the most senior Catholic in Hungary, but he was in prison. And from 1949 through to 1956, he was in prison. And then he was released during the time of the 1956 uprising. And then he made a broadcast that could certainly be deemed inflammatory. He was very much demanding lands to be returned to the Roman Catholic Church, because of course the communists had taken away their land, and very much people should go back to the churches and listen to their religious leader and stop with the godless communism. So obviously the uprising was crushed. Now Mindszenty could have left Hungary, because a lot of people there, but Mindszenty chose not to leave Hungary. He said, well, I'm the Archbishop of Esztergom. I'm the most senior Catholic in Hungary. I'm going to stay. But there was really no possibility of his in any way, carrying on as a religious leader in Hungary. So what happened is that the 1956 government, the Nod government, had essentially annulled Mindszenty's conviction, the 1949 conviction um, of Rákosi. So that was annulled. But then once the Nod government itself was annulled, with that annulment came the annulment of Mindszenty's conviction. So as things stood, um, he was still a convicted criminal, and so the really, if he were to stay in Hungary in '56, he would be arrested by the new rulers and be returned to prison. Basically, he was sentenced, I think, to life imprisonment, and he would go back to prison to serve out his term. So Mindszenty sought refuge in the U.S. Embassy. And the U.S. Embassy basically, they granted him asylum. But that was a real problem there, because yes, he could stay at the U.S. Embassy, but he couldn't step outside. He was in the sort of Julian Assange situation. Okay, you're in the embassy, but the moment you step outside, you will be arrested by the Hungarian authorities. So this went on from 1956 through to 1971. So this was a long sojourn inside the U.S. Embassy. And Mindszenty insisted during this time he's still the Archbishop of Esztergom. He's still the most senior Catholic in the country. He's still the primate of Hungary. Now, obviously, the Kada regime didn't accept this, but he said, I don't care whether you accept it or not. As far as the Vatican is concerned, I am the Archbishop of Esztergom. The problem was that the Vatican began to get a little tired of all of this, because this decided, I guess it's part of Vatican II, to make it peace with the communists. Therefore it was in the interests of the Catholic Church to have fairly courteous or civil relations with the communist regimes, because then the communist regimes ruling over the largely Catholic countries would make concessions, and they did that. They made concessions to the Catholic Church. They opened the Catholic churches for religious service. They opened the Catholic schools, but all of that was in some ways in jeopardy when you have essentially a symbol of the resistance to communism. I mean, Mindszenty was a ferociously anti-communist, a symbol of the resistance to communism, a symbol of 1956, insisting on staying in Hungary in the U.S. Embassy. This was the U.S. Embassy, the leader of the anti-communist global coalition is in the embassy, and there was just a very sore point with the Hungarian government. And if the friction caused by Mindszenty could jeopardize whatever gains the Catholic Church had accomplished in communist Hungary. So, well, you can see where this is going. Basically, they wanted Mindszenty to go. The Vatican wanted Mindszenty to leave. And the Americans, who also, from about the 1960s on, began to be interested in a détente with the communist world, they also wanted Mindszenty to go. And so the Vatican suggested to him, well, maybe you could step down as Archbishop of Esztergom. He said, no, absolutely not. Maybe you can leave the country. No, I'm not leaving the country. I'm the primate of Hungary, and I'm staying. Um, so those, he was getting pressure from everybody. He was getting pressure from the Vatican that maybe, just maybe you could maybe at the very least step aside. If you step aside as Archbishop of Esztergom, then you won't be such a sore point for the for the communist regime, and they wouldn't do it. But so this went on, as I say, through 1971, when they finally, and the exact mechanics of how this was done has never really been exactly explained. How he left the country, I think obviously there was some way in which U.S. diplomatic vehicles were allowed to leave the U.S. embassy with Mindszenty inside. They took him to the airport. The Hungarian authorities had said, we will not in any way tamper with these U.S. diplomatic vehicles. And they reached the airport, and he was allowed to board a plane, and he landed in Vienna. All of this was really only came out later, so nobody really knew anything about it until the Hungarian government announced that Mindszenty had left Hungary. And this was 1971, and he left a very bitter man because he felt he hadn't been treated well by the Vatican. He was hoping to get at least the Vatican would support him, but he felt that he had been put under a lot of pressure by the Vatican to leave, and he was still filled with real hatred for the communists. And so for the last few years of his life living in Austria, he wrote his memoirs, and he in his memoirs he spoke very harshly about the Vatican, and obviously about the communists, and of course, about my great uncle and what terrible people all of the these Hungarian communists are and have always been. He, but subsequent to that, because if you go back in time to the sort of the era of the Cold War, he was seen as a real nuisance, because you had things that were those détente, or things were improving. Both sides seemed to want to have better relations, and Mindszenty was just someone who was in the way of that. So he was really didn't enjoy particularly sympathetic coverage in the media. He was more like seen as a throwback to the intense anti-communism of pre-World War II Hungary. But anyway, but since then, Mindszenty, his reputation has risen. So he had insisted before he died that he was not to be buried in Hungary until the communists had gone. So until after the communists had gone. So he was reburied. So his body was brought back to Hungary in 1991 and reburied in Hungary, it was quite a big deal when that happened. But gradually, step by step, he has now come to be seen as a martyr, and there are moves afoot within the Catholic Church led by Peter Erdo to have him canonized. Now that's a long process. It's not that easy to have to get canonized, but there are figures within the church like Erdo who are actively involved in seeking to have him canonized. I think that's going to take some time, but that's what Erdo is mostly associated with. That his support and championing and I don't know, sort of rehabilitation of the reputation of Mindszenty. So if he were to become Pope, then I think there would be really very strong moves to have Mindszenty declared a saint. The very figure whom the Vatican wanted gone. Can you just leave the embassy, please? And the Americans, can you just leave the embassy, please? That didn't happen. So that's it'll be interesting whether Erdo. I have my doubts, to be honest. That he's being talked about as the Conservatives' candidate, but I have my doubt that Erdo will secure the votes for the to be elected Pope, because I think something like 80% of the conclave are cardinals who have been appointed to that position by Francis. And I would imagine most of them, not necessarily all of them, but most of them will want to stick with the with the Francis's agenda. Well, but anyway, we'll see. There's one other thing that I want to talk about Vietnam, and we talked about the Vietnam war with Peter yesterday, and I think it's a complicated history, and it's easy to moralize, as it always is. It's always easy to moralize, but you have to then at least go back in time, how the world was seen by America's rulers in the early 1950s, and then see how gradually America got sucked into Vietnam, and a lot of things were not that obvious then, as they became clear later. So like the idea that there existed something like the split between the Soviet Union and Mao's China really didn't become apparent until the early 1960s. No one really thought that in the 1950s. It was thought that they were part of a communist bloc, and they believed that the communists would prevail throughout Asia. So the communists, it was quite a shock for the Americans when Mao won. The Americans have been backing Chiang Kai-shek. They didn't expect Chiang Kai-shek to lose, but he lost, and he was then seen as a great victory for Stalin, and to a certain extent, he was a victory for Stalin, though I think Stalin knew right away that it would be hard to keep the Chinese communists in a subordinate position. So, but while the Chinese communists absolutely didn't dare to question Stalin's authority within the communist world, that changed with Stalin's successors. With Khrushchev, they didn't have a very high opinion of Khrushchev, and vice versa. Khrushchev did not have a very high opinion of the Chinese communists. But in any case, the question about Vietnam was that, well, in one country after another, it seemed like the communists were in a strong position, particularly after the victory of Mao. If Mao can prevail in China, then Ho Chi Minh was likely to prevail in Vietnam, and then the Malaysia, and then Indonesia, and then of course the big prize, as the Americans saw it, was Japan. They thought that the communists would win out in Japan. It had a powerful communist party there. So that was the perception at the time. Then of course the Americans did. They did a lot of foolish things. In Vietnam, their most foolish and most arrogant and idiotic thing that they did was, of course, to engineer the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was not a bad leader in South Vietnam, but certainly the best that they had. And as often happens with the Americans, they never really think through the implications. They overthrow Diem, but without any sense of, well, who's going to take over from Diem? And they didn't have anyone, and they went through these a succession of wholly implausible leaders, like Marshal Key, and there was Big Min. There was a General Min, and then finally it was Tu. But you had a whole series of these leaders who took over in Saigon. None of them had any plausible credentials to be leader of South Vietnam in the way that Diem, to a certain extent, had. So it was a disastrous decision. But the Kennedy people were absolutely determined to do it. It was a remarkable thing that they were absolutely determined through 1963, through a succession of events. They kept pressing for the ouster of Diem. And the people who were involved was obviously the U.S. ambassador in Saigon at the time, which was Henry Cabot Lodge, this very waspy family, Cabot Lodge, but the mastermind behind it was Averell Harriman, who had a position in the Kennedy administration. He was in the State Department. He was the man in the State Department responsible for Vietnam. And then there was Roger Hillsman. These are names really from the past, but he was regarded as this expert on guerrilla warfare and whatever. So he was also in the State Department. They were the kind of the masterminds of this coup against Diem, and from that moment on, because essentially South Vietnam collapsed, America owned it. I mean, they just couldn't withdraw in November 1963. November the 1st is when he was overthrown and assassinated. They couldn't withdraw because then South Vietnam would just simply cease to exist, and the communists would win out. And that was the fateful step. I mean, so the overthrow of Diem. And that, of course, the Americans had to then just step in and escalate their presence there. In effect, they took over the fighting, and so up until that time, the Americans could still say, "Well, we're just here in an advisory capacity. We're here to help arm, train the South Vietnamese forces, but we're just advisors. We're not actually doing the fighting ourselves." But from that moment on, from 63 and then 64, we have the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And then 65, February 1965, when Johnson sends in forces to Da Nang to maintain the base. Otherwise, Da Nang the Viet Cong was threatening to overrun Da Nang, so they had to bring in American forces to Da Nang Air Base. And from then on, basically, the Americans just took over the fighting. So they overthrow Diem, and therefore assume responsibility for the government in Saigon. And then they take over the fighting from the South Vietnamese, and then essentially it was absolutely hopeless, because on the one hand you had the Ho Chi Minh's forces, who were, they were getting assistance, albeit from the Soviet Union, from China, but nonetheless, this was still an indigenous force. They were doing their own fighting. Nobody was fighting for them. But in the case of the South, I mean, the Americans were doing the fighting. And then, you obviously, there was no way that you could have, you could in any way be this is a plausible fight on the part of the South Vietnamese. Well, it's not the South Vietnamese who are doing the fighting; it's the Americans who are doing the fighting for them. And but even then, the Americans, didn't do. They had opportunities for the situation to improve, and in a way, it did improve. From there, so from the calamity of 63, 64, 65, when the Americans were really, about to be overrun, and then you had the Tet Offensive, which turned into a disaster for the Viet Cong, because the Americans beat them back. And that the defeat of the Viet Cong after the Tet Offensive then at least gave the Americans some breathing room, and that enabled Nixon then to pursue his Vietnamization policy, essentially withdrawing American forces and letting the South Vietnamese take over the fighting, because there wasn't really that much fighting left to be done. And then the moment of truth came in April 1972 during the Easter offensive by Hanoi, because it seemed then, because they mounted their Easter offensive, and it looked that they were going to win, that they would now take over the South, because there weren't really too many American forces left in the South to fight. And but there was still air power, and the Americans used the air power quite effectively to basically stop the Easter offensive. And what's most important is that Nixon bombed Haiphong. He bombed Haiphong Harbor, and therefore he bombed Soviet ships. He attacked Soviet ships in Haiphong Harbor. He did this a few weeks before the Moscow summit, which was a historic summit, because this was really the first meeting between Soviet and U.S. leaders really since I probably Camp David. Camp David was with Eisenhower, so that would have been 1959. So this would have been the first one since 1959. But it was the first summit to be held in Moscow. So just a few weeks before that, Nixon then bombs the Soviet ships in Haiphong, and the Soviets took it. And why did they take it? Well, they basically thought that they had bigger fish to fry. At the Moscow summit in May 1972, they signed the first of the SALT agreements. They signed the ABM treaty, and this was really the high point of détente. And they were also signed the grain deal, which eventually was to cause a lot of bitterness, because the Soviets drove a hard bargain and bought up a lot of grain. And that, of course, led to grain shortages and a massive escalation of grain prices. But that was the Soviets did that very cleverly. But yeah, the Soviets kind of sat on their hands and allowed this bombing. They didn't really react in any particular uh, aggressive way, and the summit went ahead. Where the conventional wisdom at the time was that the Soviets would cancel the summit. I mean, how can you have a summit when the Americans are bombing Soviet ships? So that was the conventional wisdom, that Nixon's bombing of Haiphong Harbor would lead to the cancellation of the summit. There was no cancellation. The summit went ahead, and it was really Nixon's greatest triumph. I mean, once he did that, he showed his audacity in really bombing Soviet ships, which have never been done. And he did this just a few weeks before the summit, when it was likely that the Soviets would cancel the summit and therefore be a humiliation for him. But he did it. The summit went ahead, and the election was effectively over then and there. Now, the thing which I think gets overlooked is that the Americans, say, well, the Americans lost in Vietnam, and I think it's an oversimplification, because without question, I mean, the Viet Cong and Hanoi, I mean, they fought with extraordinary tenacity and bravery. They defeated the French, and they fought everything that the Americans, they took everything that they absorbed, everything that the Americans threw at them. But militarily, the Americans won. I mean, the attempt essentially to overthrow the government in Saigon by the Viet Cong failed. That they didn't succeed in doing that. The Americans, that goal, because the Americans did not set themselves as a goal to overthrow the regime in Hanoi. I mean, they learned their lesson from the Korean War, when essentially MacArthur decided he was going to go and topple the Pyongyang regime. They learned their lesson. They're not going to do that. They're going to leave the communists in place in Hanoi. All the Americans wanted was to maintain the partition and the government in Saigon, and that the Americans had accomplished. I mean, you'd have to say that they had accomplished that goal. So that part was accomplished. The second part, which was, well, was this a long-term solution? Could this survive, this government in Saigon that the Americans had established there and had fought for? Could it survive? That part, no. The Americans failed there. It had no viability. It couldn't survive. So you can say militarily. I mean, that's why I think people confuse and say, "Oh, Americans lost in Vietnam." They didn't lose militarily. They did not lose militarily. But politically, without question, they lost. Now, you had Nixon. Nixon always said, "Well, if I'd stayed in power, if I were there in 1975." So P. Durpan says, "What about the Phoenix program?" Yeah, these were very nasty, but the Phoenix program was, again, quite successful. It was vicious, really nasty, but successful. I mean, you'd have to be realistic in all of these things, and say, well, was the Phoenix program successful? Yeah, it was quite successful. That's not a commendation of a program. It was very, very nasty and very brutal, as all counterinsurgency programs are, extremely brutal. But it was reasonably successful, much as the British after World War I, when they fought against the IRA using the black and tans. Again, really brutal fight. All the the French in Algeria, also very brutal, essentially dynamiting homes, killing many civilians, but not unsuccessful. And that's, you have, violence is successful. I mean, that's why people resort to it, because, it can, can and does achieve a lot of things. Now, so you could say, yeah, that the militarily it was reasonably successful, politically very unsuccessful. But you can also then argue, when finally the communists prevailed in 1975, it didn't really matter very much because the world had moved on. So when, back in 40, what was it, 46, when Ho Chi Minh declared the kind of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and then the French moved in, and then there was the fighting, and then the partition, and so on. Let's say from the early 1950s, the world had moved on in those 20 years. And by 1975, to be honest, no one really thought the whole of Asia was going to go communist. The communists had tried to take over in Indonesia, but were crushed by the anti-communist military. So about whether there was a real coup, the communists really tried to take over. Again, we can talk about that another time. But 1965, the military said, "Oh, there was an attempt by the communists to seize power, insert Sukarno as the nominal president," and then the military responded and went with a real vengeance against the communists. Who knows how many people? 1 million people may have been killed. 2 million. No one knows exact numbers, but it was a horrific massacres that took place. But nonetheless, the communists were defeated in Indonesia. So that was one of the prizes the communists were hoping to gain, and they didn't gain it. And then, of course, again, in Japan, the communists didn't win out. Malaysia, they didn't win out. So when Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos become communist, it just didn't really matter that much. So therefore, the Americans could say, okay, well, we didn't exactly fail. Yeah, all right, the communists have won in Vietnam, but I mean, all right, but it's kind of the much wealthier countries in Asia had not gone communist. So, we lost out in Vietnam, but we didn't lose out elsewhere. So, so my view is that it's a kind of a mixed bag, and one has to see the whole of the Vietnam episode as a kind of as a complex historical event. And rather than, I think what you get in the alt media is a kind of a very facile moralizing, and so I wanted to say this apropos of the film. We showed The Deer Hunter, which I didn't vote for, and I don't particularly like, but some people said, well, it presents the communists in a very in a caricatured way, and so it was just the usual kind of Hollywood anti-communist. And I think that's fair, except that that's not really what the film is trying to do. The film is trying to present Vietnam as really a kind of this horrible war that good, decent Americans coming from immigrant stock were pushed into. These were poor people, living there in their communities. They were pushed into this war, and in the jungles of Southeast Asia, were all sorts of corrupting influences, and that the Americans who went there were corrupted. So they were good people. The Americans were good, decent people, but once they got there, they got corrupted. Now, corrupted by whom? By the communists, by the Vietnamese, by the French, by imperialism, all sorts of bad things. So I think the Russian roulette scenes, very powerfully done, were made up. And I mean, there's no justification for that. It was completely made up. I mean, there's no evidence at all that American prisoners of war were forced to play Russian roulette. But I think the film just tried to say, well, okay, this is the corruption that the Americans were sucked into, and that through no fault of their own, that these people who were just being pushed into these were just ordinary, decent, hardworking Midwesterners who had no business being in Vietnam. They should never have been dragged there. So it's very much a kind of an American, I don't know what you could call it, isolationist or theme, which is, well, we need to just stay out of other people's wars, other people's countries. We should just live out. We have a nice way of life in America, and we should just not get involved in these. And that's an important strand of American thinking. And just trying to think of, oh, it's communist or anti-communist or whatever. It doesn't really work here. It's the thinking of the Charles Lindbergh of America First, and Trump himself kind of taps into that. Is that, oh, well, what do you think of Russia? What do you think of Putin? Or, blah, 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 blah. That's not what Trumpism is about. The Trumpism is about, we don't want to get involved in this. It's not our war. It's not, it doesn't matter to us Americans where the Russia-Ukraine border will be. Then that's the kind of the essence of this kind of Trumpian MAGA America First thinking. It's not, they're not pro-Putin. That's why people say, oh, he's pro-Putin. They're not pro-Putin. They just say it doesn't matter to us. We simply don't care, whether it's Russia or Ukraine or where the border is or who's going to be in charge in Crimea. It's just a matter of we got to get out of this. And I think that's that was the theme of the Deer Hunter. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page. These are the contributors. These are the people who really make this the Gaggle community thrive, and particularly they keep the dogs happy. Well, to the extent that they can be happy, they don't really like happy. I mean, compared to these dogs, I'm a happy-go-lucky, cheerful person. The dogs aren't like that. Anyway, Robert says the censorship fool in the Biden administration used atrocious in her bad send-up of Mary Poppins. Oh God, yes, I remember that. The funny thing is like, because our friend earlier used the word atrocious. It's I'm trying to think when was the last time I heard that. I mean, I think one of David Mamet's the film House of Games. It was David Mamet wrote the screenplay, and there somebody used that the guy said, "I'm sorry, I treated you atrociously," and it was just funny because it's that use of that word was just hilarious. I'm sorry, I treated you atrociously. So just Anne Marie, thank you so much as always. Thank you for your kindnesses. And then Judy Hotchkiss, welcome. Always good to see you. And so Judy says, Medvedev comments on Ukraine mineral deal after Ukraine says that they can use the proceeds to purchase weapons. Trump has broken the Kiev regime to the point where they will have to pay for U.S. aid with mineral resources. Now the Ukrainians will have to pay for military supplies with the national wealth of a disappearing country. Well, I think it's you can read the. I mean, I think the agreement as such is still very vague, but um, it's if you read the agreement, then it does seem to say that somehow the United States um, if will contribute that the money that the United States uh, gives to Ukraine through military assistance or whatever will actually go into this fund to which itself will be then replenished by by extraction of the resources of Ukraine. So, I mean, the exact mechanics of it isn't clear, but that's what the deal says. That you have this fund. This fund is actually going this joint Ukraine United States fund, which will be, the money in that fund will come from the extraction of resources. So whatever um, the United States contributes to that fund, which from sending arms to Ukraine, will be replenished from the extraction of resources. And so, therefore, it could be argued that Ukraine will have to pay for any further American assistance. So I can see how you can argue that. Um, However, it's a far cry from what the original deal was supposed to be. I mean, remember Trump was suggesting that the 350 billion that the Americans had supposedly given to Ukraine, um, Ukraine is going to have to pay for that. So therefore, out of this fund, essentially coming in from the extraction of Ukraine resources, that they were going to have to pay for that 350 billion. Essentially, it was a 350 billion debt that Ukraine was going to have to pay off. That's gone. So, as things stand, according to this agreement, is that Ukraine will only have to pay for any future military assistance. So, in other words, whatever America then sends to Ukraine, that will have to be paid back through the extraction of resources. Um, so it's no longer you're paying off this outstanding debt. Um, but you can look at it in another way, because if that's so, if the Trump administration can say, well, look, it's now we're not just giving money to Ukraine. This is money that will be paid back. How will you pay it back? We're going to pay it back through this joint U.S.-Ukraine investment fund. So it's actually, you could say, well, Trump has a means of justifying um, the sending, the continuing sending of resources to Ukraine. He says, well, everything that we're now going to send to Ukraine will be paid back out of this fund. So no, yeah, the debt, that's not going to be paid off, or the 350 billion, forget that. But future U.S. Aid will be paid back out of this fund. Now, I still think this is all a lot of pie in the sky, because nobody knows exactly what resources there are in Ukraine. The minerals that they're talking about, that's based on maps, Soviet maps from the 1960s. There hasn't been any updated map of resources since the 1960s. So who knows how much mineral resources there really are in Ukraine. But Trump could, if he was of a mind to do so, and I don't know if he is of a mind to do so, he could justify, um, sending further military aid to Ukraine on the basis of, well, now I can guarantee that this whatever we send will be paid back. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's what Trump wants to do, because as as um, uh, as we discussed in a recent podcast, uh, Trump may just simply say, "Hey, I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. I've prevented Russia from taking over the whole of Ukraine." So hey, we won the war. Russia didn't take the whole of Ukraine. 80% of Ukraine will remain in the hands of Kiev, and that and I know Gagglers will probably disagree with it. That could be the basis of a deal, because Russia really has given up on the regime change. I mean, I don't hear too much regime change from Moscow. Even that June 2024 speech from Putin, in which he outlined the conditions for a Russian ceasefire, he just said withdraw from the four oblasts, and no NATO membership. So that could be done, but he didn't say, "Oh, we need a regime change." And as things stand, Russia is not demanding elections as a condition for peace talks. They said they're ready to negotiate without any fresh elections. Anyway, thank you so much, Judy. And is this frozen or what? And then Judy adds, Judy adds, quoting Medvedev, and the U.S. Senate, led by Republicans, is. All right, let's see. Let's frozen. Let me. Yep. All right. Yep. And the U.S. Senate, led by Republicans, so I was quoting Medvedev, and the U.S. Senate, led by Republicans, is preparing to introduce more crushing sanctions against us. Let's see how the new administration responds. Trump's ratings have gone down. The deep state is putting up a fierce resistance to him. Well, I think that's true. But on the other hand, it's the Republicans. They don't like Russia. They don't like Trump's policy. But on the other hand, they are in a bind. I mean, Trump can just simply veto any further sanctions. They could try to override his veto, but that would be very difficult. I'm not sure the Republicans particularly want to override. Trump is still in a very strong political position. He is the leader of the Republican Party. So I don't know whether too many Republicans will want to override his veto. So if they press for sanctions and in defiance of Trump, because Trump does not want to sanctions now. He's against sanctions now because he still thinks we're in the peace process stage, so sanctions are counterproductive. So if they push forward with that, I think Trump would veto any sanctions. And then I think they did override his veto on sanctions during his first term, but I think that's a different situation. He's in a much stronger position within the Republican Party than he was back then. So, and, 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 I mean, I think at the moment they're not going to. I think the prospects of additional sanctions on Russia are not, are not likely for the time being. It all depends on how Trump um, goes. I mean, it could just simply go either way. Uh, you could argue that Rubio's quote promotion unquote could strengthen the hands of those who want sanctions against Russia, who want to get tough with Russia. But maybe not. I mean, it may be just Trump doesn't know whom to appoint as national security advisor, and he's given Rubio this other position. So we don't know. Trump seems to move from one thing to another when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. It's not clear at all how, at this stage, um, how he's going to come out in the end. Um, but yeah, no one's deep state or whatever. The Washington consensus is very anti-Russian, and the Washington consensus is we need to keep this war going against Russia. The people who are against it are really in a minority, even within the Trump team. You've got Trump, you've got Steve Witkoff, you got Elon Musk, but Musk may be on the way out. I think it does look like Musk is on the way out. He's got these various billionaires, David Sachs, um, who basically the Trump view, which is we need to bring this war to an end. It's a minority position in Washington. So far, Trump is able to maintain that minority position given his stature, and no one is dares to defy him. He won that election, but that's still a remarkable accomplishment. And just because he slipped in the polls, that's not going to. I don't think that'll persuade too many Republicans at this stage to defy him. Maybe down the road they will, but at the moment, I don't think too many Republicans will dare to defy him. Whatever they may think about Russia. And Richard Phillips says president ratings always go down. That's hardly a big deal. Yeah, I agree. I don't think that's it's bound to go down, and particularly if you're a very proactive president. I mean, it always goes. The more proactive you are, the more your ratings tank. I mean, it's better if you just stay out of the limelight. People don't really hear or see you very much. Your poll numbers remain static. But when you're around all the time, every time you turn on the television and you see him, he's again giving a news conference, he's again talking to reporters. Another truth is always dominating the news. People get tired of that, and so you start, going tanking in the polls. So that's why I agree. I don't think these poll numbers matter very much. And Richard says, and deep state always resists any positive change. Again, nothing new. And then Judy says, what is significant is that Medvedev says it's sympathetic. Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, the Russians have been very positive towards Trump. And it's not just Medvedev, but I think Lavrov, Putin, not one of them, not one Russian leader, and that applies even to the those who are just a little bit lower in the rankings, like Zaharova, was the foreign ministry spokesperson, or Peskov, which is Putin's press secretary. Not once do they say anything against Trump. They say bad things about the United States, all the bad things, but always very respectful towards Trump. They say the Trump administration, yeah, we like the things that we're hearing from the Trump administration. So I think the Russians are still hopeful that they can work something out with Trump. And it's still possible. I mean, I think, one shouldn't just dismiss it and say, oh, it's not going to work out, nothing's going to work out. It's still possible that they could work something out with Trump. So I think that's why the Russians, from Putin down, never say anything negative about Trump. It's like they treat almost with piety, like of Trump. Oh well, we're very always. No. We're hearing good things from Donald Trump. And then Marx, thank you very much. Marx says Trump, the great deal maker, just made a terrible deal with Ukraine, the sort of deal that Biden would be happy to sign. What has come out of the saga is that the real author of the art of the deal has been revealed. The name is Zelensky. I don't know. I think that's much too early to say whether this is a good or a bad deal. You can argue it whichever way. I mean, nothing is going to happen with any of this extraction until until I think the war comes to an end. I mean, because who's going to invest money in Ukraine while the war is continuing? It's just, this just doesn't. I mean, what we were talking about earlier with it seems like within this agreement that somehow America, any military aid proffered by the United States will be counted as a contribution to this investment fund, and therefore it'll be repaid with revenue from extraction. I don't know how that's going to work, because again, why would anyone invest? And extraction is a very heavily capital intensive activity. Whether even coal, oil, and gas. I mean, that's you need to put in a lot of capital, and while there's a war on, no one's going to risk any capital. So, what I was thinking about, that the United States and what Medvedev was saying is, oh well, Ukraine is now going to have to pay for any further military assistance. That could serve as a justification for continuing the military aid. So if you want to continue military aid and say, hey, but you got the military aid, well, they said, yeah, but it's going to be paid back. And so when you say it's a bad deal, well, we don't know. I mean, Trump could say, look, it's going to get paid back. That's the whole point of this deal. I think I think it's a lot of this deal is just it's on a paper. It's not anything real as of yet. Robert, thank you very much, Robert, as always, for your generosity. Robert says, interestingly, Thomas Merton stood at the opposite end of the Catholic spectrum from the staunch anti-communists of his time. While not endorsing communism, he criticized blind anti-communist fervor, warning it could distort Christian values and fuel violence. Merton urged dialogue, compassion, and a focus on peace, seeing ideological hatred as incompatible with the gospel. I think that's well, no, I agree. I mean, with Mindszenty was kind of really a throwback to an earlier era, because say the Catholic Church in Poland during the communist era, led by Cardinal Mindszenty, they managed to work out some kind of a concordat with the communist regime. So if the communists allowed Catholic service, Catholic rituals, allowed people to conduct, their Catholic lives, as long as they didn't interfere in politics, and that was the basis of the deal. That we'll give you all this, we'll give you your Catholic practices and so on. Just don't interfere in politics. And I think that was the attitude of Cardinal Mindszenty, and I think of other church leaders in communist times. Mindszenty really wasn't like that. Mindszenty was absolutely someone who was going to interfere in politics, which is why Kadar wasn't really prepared to allow Mindszenty to stay in Hungary. I mean, he would become absolutely a polarizing figure, and a leader of the anti-communist opposition. I think Mindszenty really made no secret of that. That's what he would do if he were released from the U.S. embassy, and so that's really what caused all the problems. If Mindszenty were willing to leave, then the problems would go away. But Mindszenty and if Mindszenty were willing to stay and be non-political, not become the focus of anti-communist resistance, then maybe he could have been released and just do his Catholic stuff, because Kada was actually quite tolerant towards the people of in 1956. So the 1956, the leaders were executed, including of course Imre Nagy. But those who were kind of on a bit below that, they were released from prison after a few years, as long as they vowed not to engage in any politics. Now, you can't really execute a cardinal, but there would have been no question. Mindszenty was ferociously anti-communist, and he would have been very quickly the focus of anti-communist resistance in Hungary. So that hence the impasse that went on for all those years. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, within the Catholic Church, there was the question. The really, with the French Catholics and with very very much the conservatives, the Action Française, the Charles Maurras, and everyone. That was an intense anti-communism that they harbored, and that led to that sort of, generated that right wing anti-communist movement in France. But that was before the war. After the war, I think it was the Catholic Church was much more conciliatory towards communism than it had been between the two world wars. Anyway, Robert, thank you so much. Appreciate your generosity. Marty, always good to see you, Marty. Happy Thursday, George and Gagglers. Thank you, Marty. Thank you very much. And then Carlos says, speaking of Algeria, do you like the works of Camus? I do, really. I like him. I didn't think he was a great writer or anything like that, but I thought he was a pretty decent writer. I mean, it was always interesting, his novels and his essays. He wasn't a deep thinker in any sense. He wasn't the equal of Sartre. I mean, there were problems about Sartre, but Sartre was certainly a serious thinker, and quite original in his thinking. Camus really wasn't that. However, I would say that Camus was a better novelist than Sartre was. I think Sartre wasn't a particularly good novelist. Sartre was not a bad dramatist. He wrote some pretty good plays. But as a novelist, I think, yeah, Camus is pretty good. Not great. I mean, I think he's well known today because he was just one of the figures of that time during the Cold War and all the Algeria. But I think he obviously disagreed with Sartre and the left on the issue of Algeria, well, which is understandable. He himself came from Algeria, and so therefore he didn't embrace the cause of Algerian independence. He was against independence, but understandable. But again, though, I think it was interesting that he took that line, which of course did not endear him to the left at the time, but by the fact because he was associated with Sartre and everything else, but his line was that independence would be absolutely wrong for Algeria, and so that kind of again made him an interesting figure, because that was definitely a very unusual stance to take for a figure ostensibly on the left at the time. Anyway, Ivan Grozny, good to see you, Ivan. It says, I know predictions aren't made of the gaggle. No, that's right. But I'm curious where you think the lines will sit and what things will look like in Ukraine by the end of the summer. I don't think there'll be too much by way of military movement. I really don't. I know there are people who are predicting major offensives, and the Russians are going to make big moves. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the much more interesting is whether Trump will bite the bullet and decide that he's going to end his commitment to Ukraine. Once he says that to Zelensky, that we're not going to do this anymore, that will force Zelensky to make concessions. And I think if Zelensky were to concede, in other words, and go back to what Putin demands in June 2024, at least withdraw from the oblasts, that if Zelensky were willing to do that, I think that could be the basis, essentially, of an end to the war. Russia gives up on the regime change. I think that's just not realistic. Russia would certainly insist on limitations on the size of Ukraine armed forces, limitations on any foreign military presence, limitations on any imports of arms by Ukraine. I mean, something that could be worked out. But Trump would have to go down this path. Trump would have to, take a political risk and do this. To be honest, this deal doesn't help. I don't think it hinders it either. I don't think this deal is anything special. Trump just likes the idea. I think Trump just likes the idea of deals. On the other hand, Trump is sensible enough. He's a businessman. He knows about real estate deals. He knows a deal from something that is just simply words on a piece of paper. There's no deal here. There's no plan to break ground. There's no plan to build anything, to extract anything. I mean, it's just a theoretical construct. I mean, you need to first even do a survey. You haven't done a survey for 60 years. I mean, they got to do a survey and find out what there is to extract. So I don't think necessarily this deal signed today with Ukraine is that necessarily that significant, but it could be. That's why I think predictions are a little difficult. I hope Trump will see a way out of it and say that hey, we can get something done. Russia take 20% of Ukraine. Okay, we sign off on that. We keep 80%. And then Trump sells it as saying, well, Putin could have taken 100%. I stopped Putin from taking 100%, and that would be a way of selling it as a victory for the United States. Otherwise, I mean, then it just goes on. So, if you ask me for the prediction, I don't know. Could go either way. Could go either way at this stage. Anyway, and then Mark says, George, what is your view with the Americans putting pressure on countries to cease trading with China if they want good trade agreements with America? Well, that's obviously that's the line the United States would take, and I think it will probably succeed, or at least not in every way, but I think it will succeed. I don't think countries necessarily are putting their bets on China. So it's basically the American view, the Trump's view is that, hey, if you want access to our market, and it particularly applies to the countries of Southeast Asia. If you want access to our market, and you're running huge trade surpluses with us, if you want to continue doing that, don't start trying to present a united front with China. I think that's more likely to succeed than China's attempt. Let's form an anti-Trump front. And China has tried to do that without very much success so far. They started off with, Japan and South Korea has joined us in an anti-Trump front. Japan and South Korea immediately distanced themselves. They said, no, we didn't. We didn't say we were going to join an anti-Trump front. So I think it makes sense. If you want access to the American market, then then Trump is telling them, don't start forming fronts with China and negotiate something with us. And one of the things that the United States will insist upon, and this is particularly the case with Vietnam, but other countries in Southeast Asia, is that you don't become a hub for re-exporting Chinese goods. So so essentially you allow your country to be used as a mechanism for China to evade our tariffs, and that's obviously going to be the basis of any negotiations with countries in Southeast Asia. You can't be a transshipment hub for China. So it's rough. It's kind of a rough negotiation, but it's understandable why the United States is doing that. Anyway, Ivan Grozny says, and what do you make of the territory of Sumy and Kharkov oblasts that the Russians have taken? The Russians have been advancing slowly in the Kupiansk direction of Kharkov region, but are they planning on keeping that in a deal if the main focus is on Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk? It seems like Kupiansk is more strategic, but they haven't held a referendum there. My feeling is that they're doing that in order to create a buffer zone there, that they have no intention of taking that territory. They've given no indication that they have any intention of incorporating them within the Russian Federation. I think that they're building a buffer zone, which is going to be part of the any kind of agreement, which is you have the oblasts, which will be incorporated with the Russian Federation, even though no one's going to recognize it, but the Russians will just simply take it, and they're going to need a demilitarized zone, and that this will serve as a demilitarized zone or a buffer zone. I mean, it's essentially. If it goes back to, well, why did you launch the special military operation? Well, we need some means of defending ourselves from a potential NATO onslaught, and so therefore we need this incorporating the south and southeast of Ukraine within the Russian Federation, and then in the north. We need a buffer zone. So I think that's I think what they're trying to do there. Anyway, thank you, Ivan Grozny, for that question. And where are we? That's right. Robert says, didn't Bush the Dimmer claim to read Camus? I don't remember that. That's interesting. I wonder why he said that. Well, maybe it was at the time of the global war on terror, and somehow that was the time of the dangers from Islamofascism and Islamic extremism, and so maybe that's why he said he had read Camus, so he knew something about the dangers of Islam, and that is an issue. That was definitely an issue at the time of the war in Algeria, of the National Liberation Front, because the NLF was, without question, that was Islamist, and somebody like Camus obviously he wasn't at all enthused about the idea of Algeria becoming this Islamist stronghold. So that was, so that I didn't know Bush had said that, but it's understandable why he would have thought, yeah, well, Camus was no friend of the Islamists. And Sinook says, thanks for the info, Mindszenty. Interesting. Did you see the conclave? Horrible ending. Yeah, I didn't, because I read about it and I thought this is going to be really annoying. And I hate watching films that annoy me. They put me in a bad mood, and then I get depressed and annoyed, and it's not good for my health. So I avoided it. But everything I heard about it made it sound really dreadful. So I don't think I'm gonna see it, to be honest. Anyway, Psinok, thank you so much for your generosity. Mark says, more like blackmail, George, is the way I see it. Well, maybe. In terms of the negotiations, I don't know whether it's exactly blackmail, but it's more like quid pro quo, as I think the elder Bush talked about when he was trying to defend himself and saying that he was not involved in Iran-Contra. He said, "Oh yeah, I talked to all these various Central American governments, but there was no quid pro quo in the support for the Contras, which at various points was illegal for the U.S. government to engage in. So no quid pro. So I think there's always quid pro quo, and so that's the way it goes in business. There's going to be some kind of a deal. There's no question. These countries, they live off the United States. They live off access to the U.S. market. They will come to a deal. Businessmen do that. Businessmen come to a deal. That's the whole point of being in business, to come to a deal. Because if you don't come to a deal, you're not making money, and that doesn't make any sense. So if you're in the business of making money, then you come to a deal, and I think they will come to a deal. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you so much, everybody who has joined me. Thank you very much for all of your really interesting questions and comments. Thank you above all to those who contributed so generously. Ivan Grosny says, George, if you don't watch bad movies out of concern for your health, this profession probably isn't helping. Well, I would say, in my defense, is that, when I was younger, I did watch films that, however much I hated them, I'd watch them. I would read books. However much I hated them, I would still read them. You say, oh, this book is really depressing. Okay, I'll read it. But now if you tell me, hey, this book is really depressing, I'll say, I think I'll give it a miss. And says, oh, well, this film is really going to get you down. Yeah, I'll give it a miss. I guess the older you get, the more protective you have to be of your health. So that's my justification. But anyway, thank you. We'll be doing some podcasts over the weekend, Friday and then Sunday, and then Monday. Then we have our joint live streaming with Peter, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and then Tuesday we're back solo. Hope to see you all then. Until then, thank you. Good night. All the best. See you soon.